So, a very good morning to everyone. It's really a
Just a
pleasure
minute,
to.
please wait, sir. Just दुबे जी अपने आप को अनम्यूट कर लीजिए.
Okay, should I begin now?
हाँ, I am able to hear you. I am asking Amresh.
Yeah.
He also unmuted. Right. You can start, sir. Please.
Okay. Okay. So, good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to see such a large number of participants joining us today. First of all, I want to welcome Amresh ji, who was very kind to accept our invitation, and in spite of the foundation meetings, he agreed to be with us this morning. Amresh ji will be talking about the mirror of relationship. As the customary introduction, I'll say a little bit about Amresh ji. He's a trustee of the Krishnamurti Foundation India, has been principal of Rajghat Besant School and also Sahyadri School. Amresh ji first became acquainted with Krishnamurti's works while he was studying physics in college. Subsequently, he pursued his studies in philosophy for nearly a decade. His interest in Krishnamurti grew alongside, and eventually he returned to India from US and joined Rajghat Besant School in 1997, where he became a teacher and also the principal of the school. After a few years, he moved to Sahyadri School as principal, where he continues till today. His main interest lies in exploring the teachings of Krishnamurti in their full significance, and also more specifically in the context of living and learning in a Krishnamurti school. We are very happy to have you, Amresh ji. The format is that you can give your talk for about 50 minutes to an hour, followed by question answer sessions, or if somebody wants to make an observation. So that is the way we have been doing it. With these words, I'll request Amresh ji to please begin your talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Dubey. Am I clearly audible to everybody?
Yes.
Good morning to everybody. The topic of my talk is the mirror of relationship. I chose this topic because I felt it would enable us to explore some of the real questions about life, relationship, and education. To be specific, we will explore the question of self-inquiry and the question of right education. The connection between right education and self-inquiry is readily seen. Right education is necessary to nurture the learning mind, and it is only the learning mind that can undertake the journey into self-inquiry. I will draw upon my understanding of Krishnamurti's teachings and some of my own inquiries into the challenges posed by him. Our lives seem to be deeply entrenched in the ways of the self, which Krishnamurti has called a center of unified craving. From this center arises dependency, because we depend on the things we crave for, the things we become attached to. Dependency, in turn, gives rise to possessiveness. Once possessiveness has taken root, it generates fear of loss, frustration, and conflict. And if fear of loss, frustration, and conflict aren't the predominant factors in one's life, it is perhaps likely that one is living a life of habit and security in one's relationships. Whether we live in the suffering created by fear or in the comfortable dullness of security in relationship, most people do not seem inclined to deeply inquire into themselves. Neither suffering nor dullness seems to prompt us to ask, who am I really? Or what is the truth about human experience? Now, Krishnamurti has said that the mirror of relationship can reveal to us who we truly are. He has said that if you pursue God or something spiritual without examining who you are in actual relationship, then you will be caught. Then you will be caught up in some illusion. The way to truth, wisdom, and intelligence lies in the investigation of our actual selves in the mirror of relationship. The suggestion that we observe ourselves in the mirror of relationship seems reasonable because we can know ourselves as we actually are only in relationship. For instance, I may imagine I'm free from being hurt, but the moment someone says something insulting to me, I feel small or I feel indignant. This reveals to me that I do get hurt. The mirror of relationship gives me factual evidence that my idea about myself was false, an illusion. Obviously then, merely thinking something or the other about myself in isolation is an entirely unreliable instrument of self-knowledge. So looking into this mirror of relationship implies looking at my actual relationship with people, with ideas, and with things. This is clear. Unfortunately, our vision is clouded. We don't seem to have the eyes to look. It's not that we don't have the instrument of observation. We do. I would say our vision is clouded because we are not deeply interested in looking into the mirror to learn from it. We do have the occasional insight into something. Perhaps a moment in which I see my own selfish motive clearly, or I see how self-deceptive it is to blame someone else for something, and so on. But these fleeting moments of insight don't seem to generate a sustained inquiry. Why not? How is it that we don't undertake this inquiry and pursue it fully? When you think about this, it seems strange, doesn't it? Because we are always in relationship with our own thoughts and feelings, with people and with things. The mirror of relationship is definitely and unavoidably near at hand. And yet, except perhaps when we suffer greatly, we don't seem to be interested in discovering the truth about ourselves and our experience. This seems to be our profound and tragic human predicament, isn't it? Even when we suffer greatly, our attempts to look inward are abandoned when the crisis has disappeared. There doesn't seem to be an abiding interest, a fundamental interest. Why aren't we fundamentally interested? Maybe because we are deeply conditioned to seeking fulfillment. And the mind finds a multitude of ways to pursue fulfillment. For example, through belief in some ideology, through the pursuit of pleasure, through possessing another in a relationship, through the vanity of the expert or the one who knows, and so on. We carry on in all these ways of seeking fulfillment, even though we realize from our own experience that the seeking of fulfillment is like being tied to a stake by a leash. There may be some movement, some freedom of movement, but only so far as the leash will allow, and then the leash pulls back. Sooner or later, there is suffering. This seems to be our conditioning. The seeking of fulfillment, the inevitability of suffering, and the avoidance of self-knowledge. We do not see the truth of this conditioning clearly enough because of two reasons, I think. First, society has established the seeking of fulfillment as a way of life. And we are deeply afraid, I think we are deeply afraid to deny or negate all that and stand alone. Secondly, we are not educated at home or in school in a culture that reveals to us what it means to inquire into oneself. So we remain lost, misled both by the outer, that is society, and by the inner, our unawakened minds. This is perhaps the greatest challenge of our times. Our gradual absorption into a technology-driven culture which blatantly and cleverly assigns the greatest value to personal fulfillment and the seeking of pleasure. In this culture, there is no interest in self-inquiry. The pursuit of personal fulfillment and the seeking after pleasure in contemporary society are becoming even greater forms of self-deception, greater forms of illusion. More than ever before, we are powerfully held by the attractions of entertainment and the habituated use of digital technologies. The entertainment industry and the IT companies are working harder than ever to capture the attention of consumers. Their intention is to persuade us and attract us to buy and use their digital products more and more in an ever-increasing cycle of compulsive obsession. Even the academic universities serve this new god. Stanford University, for example, has an IT department called, ironically and amusingly, the Lab of Persuasive Technologies. All this is accelerating a profound erosion of human culture. One wonders if, as human beings, we will be able to avoid this catastrophe that is hurtling towards us. A catastrophe in which the human mind may lose all connection with nature and with other human beings, and eventually lose itself irreversibly into the illusion of complete isolation. Meeting this challenge involves creating an environment where a different culture may prevail. A culture in which the pursuit of pleasure and the predominant societal drives are not encouraged. Indeed, this is the challenge taken up in the Krishnamurti schools. Now, if this is the state of the world, more or less as I have sketched it out, and our individual lives in it, and if we acknowledge the value and importance of self-inquiry, then we can explore its implications through two questions. One, what is right education? What does it mean to create a culture in which young minds may awaken to self-inquiry? And second, what is self-inquiry? What does it mean to look into the mirror of relationship without distortion? The first question about right education takes us into an exploration of the intent of the Krishnamurti schools. The second question about self-inquiry takes us into an exploration of the nature of observation and the place of the observer in it. Let me take up the question of self-inquiry first and return later to the question of right education. We have said that there seems to be no possibility for the human being to delve into self-knowledge so long as he's trapped in seeking self-fulfillment. So first, the ground has to be prepared for the seed of inquiry to take root. This seed of inquiry takes the form of an inward turn, an inward orientation to look at oneself, perhaps with a certain seriousness and a purposeful intent. Now we must ask, how do we look into the mirror of relationship? Let us say we are now attentive, maybe out of some profound and inescapable suffering, or perhaps out of curiosity in order to discover. Can we look at ourselves as we actually are in this mirror? Or is there a distortion which prevents this from happening? If there is a distortion, what is the nature of this distortion? If there is to be an observation of what I truly am, if there is to be an observation of what is, then I must be able to see clearly without twisting the thing that is actually there. What is the nature of this observation of things as they truly are? And what is the observer? Is there something in the nature of my looking that changes or distorts the thing observed? Are our minds conditioned to distort the mirror? These questions lie at the heart of Krishnamurti's teachings. Krishnamurti has spoken of truth, wisdom, and intelligence in the context of self-inquiry. He has spoken of the perception of truth and wisdom arising out of this perception. The operation of this insight in the context of our daily life in relationship, he calls intelligence. To go a little further, we may say that this intelligence expresses itself in the form of observation without the observer. Let us see if we can carefully examine the nature of observation, and in this context, ask what the observer is. How does the observer operate when we begin to look at, say, fear or jealousy? If we inquire into this question sufficiently, we may be able to see for ourselves what it means to observe without the observer. Now, I think it is helpful to understand how the observer creates distortions in terms of two unconscious biases that operate in our conditioning. I want to call them identification and unconscious belief. So, I'm going to talk about two unconscious biases, and there are two of these unconscious biases. The first is identification, and the second is unconscious belief. Identification and unconscious belief seem to be two different mental processes that make up the observer and create its drives and motives. I think it is of fundamental importance to understand how these distortions occur. And for this, one must ultimately investigate for oneself, because the perception of the truth about these distortions cannot be borrowed from another. Of course, it can be helpful to discuss these questions in dialogue with those who are interested in such questions, which is what we are doing now amongst ourselves. So, identification and unconscious belief. These are both biases in the sense that they distort the observation of what is. And they are both unconscious in the sense that when they are operating, there is usually no awareness of them. Why are they unconscious? Why do we remain unaware of them? We tend to be unaware because we may not be looking with a serious intent into ourselves. And as a result, we may not have stayed sufficiently with the problem. We may not have examined it enough to discover the truth about it. Another reason we may not be aware of these biases is because they may operate very quickly, like a mental reflex. It follows that in slowing down and observing quietly, we might begin to notice these reflexes. So we have two factors that make up the observer: identification and unconscious belief. And we have mentioned two reasons why we may not be aware of these unconscious biases. One, because we may not have examined them sufficiently and critically enough. And two, because these unconscious biases operate very quickly, making it difficult for us to notice them unless we slow down. Let us now briefly look at these two unconscious biases. First, identification, and then unconscious beliefs. The first aspect of the observer is identification. Identification is like a mental glue that makes the fragments of the mind stick together. Identification may happen with a word, an idea, a thought, or a feeling. For example, we become identified with our name, perhaps at a very early age. We may become identified with some ideology or belief system, like communism or one of the religions. We may become identified with some thought about ourselves, like I'm a talented artist, or with a feeling, I'm hurt. The entire range of things with which there is identification, all taken together, create what you may call your personal identity. This is the self, I think. At different times, a different identification may be salient, but potentially any of the elements of your personal identity may arise like a reflex in response to what is happening outwardly or inwardly. The second aspect of the observer is unconscious belief. Unconscious beliefs act as hidden motives and influence our thinking. They give a direction to the movement of thought, to the manner of its unfolding. For example, One may have the unconscious belief that a goal is more important than the people one is working with. And therefore, one may begin to use others for the fulfillment of that goal. Another kind of unconscious belief may be reflected as an attitude towards people. For example, one may unconsciously depend on the authority of experts or on the elders in one's family, and so on. In the context of self-inquiry, there are perhaps other subtle forms of unconscious belief that influence how we look at ourselves. Let me mention two of these. The first unconscious belief is the word is the thing. According to this unconscious belief, the word or image is the thing it denotes, the thing it refers to. This unconscious belief may perhaps not operate strongly for words that refer to outer objects. We never mistake the word bird for the actual bird, for example. But it operates powerfully in the case of words and images that refer to our inner experiences, especially our feelings. The second unconscious belief is this: the observer is an agent of change. According to this unconscious belief, the thinker or the observer can act upon thoughts and feelings in order to resolve inner suffering and solve psychological problems. This unconscious belief that the observer is an agent of change, of inward change, perhaps poses the greatest challenge in self-inquiry. Let us now apply our understanding of these two biases, identification and unconscious belief, to our inner life. To be concrete, let us take fear. What is the content of fear? And how should we go about observing it? Let us say there is a memory of some hurt, and fear occurs as a very quick response to that memory. What if it happens again? The arising of the memory of hurt, of the past hurt, and the fear as a response may happen very close together. So while the identification with the past hurt and the imagined future hurt is strong, and we are experiencing the fear, it may not be evident that there are two different mental events. First, the memory of the hurt, and then the feeling of fear in anticipation of the future imagined hurt. Now, let us consider the situation where this identification may be fairly strong, but there is also the intention to observe. Then, even though there is the inner conflict created by fear, it is on this actual ground of suffering that one may truly examine whether the mind is harboring any unconscious beliefs in the form of the observer. Considering the nature of the observer while the fear is active is essential, because only when Only then is one actually looking into the mirror of relationship. Outside the experience of fear, one is perhaps merely playing with memories and ideas about fear, devoid of any reality and devoid of the possibility of insight into the nature of the observer. So, coming back to our examination of fear, first there was the memory of the past hurt, and now there is fear and the intention to inquire. In this investigation into the nature of the observer, it is first necessary to consider that the word is not the thing. To see that whatever name or image arises as fear of the future imagined hurt, it may be just that, only a name or an image. Because the future hurt is imagined hurt, it is not a real hurt. To be lulled into treating the word as the thing may be the brain's. It is a mechanism of avoidance to prevent self-knowledge. One of the distortions in the mirror. Secondly, there may be some thinking about the fear in different ways to rationalize it or escape from it. But it is essential to ask if the thinker isn't, after all, created as the effect of the previous thought. In this case, the memory of the past hurt. And now the thinker pretends to act as if it has the agency to solve the problem of fear. It was an effect of the memory of hurt. The memory of the hurt came first. The memory of the past hurt. And now the fear of the imagined future hurt. And the sense that one can now solve that problem of fear, do something to it, escape from it, think about it. This is an illusory process where the observer pretends to be different from the thing observed, which in this case is the future imagined hurt appearing in the form of fear. So what happens when these unconscious biases are in abeyance as we critically examine this, as we stay with the problem of fear, observing and probing? Because there is no self-deception of the word as the thing, and there are no illusory movements or escapes from what is in the form of thinking about fear, then the observer is silent or dormant for a while. In such a state, the conflict is no longer experienced. This creates a different kind of perception. The conflict itself is revealed as entirely a creation of the observer and its inherent biases. With this approach of uncovering unconscious biases, one could inquire much further in this investigation of oneself in the mirror of relationship. It is worth pondering over the significance of this process of self-inquiry. We began with the mirror of relationship and asked whether one could look at the mirror without distortion. In the process of inquiring into the question, we discovered that it is our way of looking that creates the distortion. In fact, the observer is itself the seat of conflict. So, our self-inquiry has led to the insight that although the observer appears to be real, it is possible to observe oneself without the observer. And then the whole character of the experience of fear undergoes a change. The process of self-inquiry leads to the insight that the self, or the expression of the self as the observer, is an illusion, or at least you might say could be an illusion if you were beginning to explore this question. The observer has no reality of its own. It is merely a clever construct of the mind, like an optical illusion, which creates the appearance of an object where none exists, like a mirage. Let me pause for a few seconds before turning to the question of right education. So we have gone into this question of self-inquiry because, as I said, it lies at the very heart of Krishnamurti's teachings. It presents to the inquirer what may seem as a formidable challenge. And it is worthwhile studying carefully our own selves in the light of Krishnaji's teachings. What I have tried to do is to talk a little bit about it, to draw out some features of this process of investigating into ourselves. And perhaps we can come back to it during our discussions. Let me now turn to the question of right education. We had said that society influences the mind in the direction of seeking fulfillment and all that it implies. And that this conditioning prevents us from inquiring into ourselves. It prevents us from observing ourselves in the mirror of relationship. If our vision is clouded and our intention is insincere, we can't possibly begin to inquire into the nature of observation or ask whether it is possible to observe ourselves without the observer. Now, what if we created a school environment in which these societal influences were minimized, if not eliminated entirely? Would such an environment or culture create the unclouded eyes needed for self-inquiry? Such a question cannot perhaps be answered with certainty, but we can say that the right culture is conducive to nurturing the learning mind. In this context, let us explore the intent of the Krishnamurti schools. I will take up two aspects of the culture of K schools that are directly related to Krishnamurti's vision of right education. The first aspect is the significance of a non-authoritarian approach in nurturing the learning mind. In order to thrive and develop, the learning mind needs an environment that is free from authority, an environment that is without control and suppression. That is the first aspect. The second aspect I would like to consider is the value of unoccupied leisure and the quiet mind. This is important because the quiet mind can slow down and possibly begin to observe the unconscious biases of the observer. Let me begin with the learning mind, and we will end with the quiet mind. If the child is in an environment where there is authority, or he has internalized fear, or there is guilt, then that prevents his observation of himself. So the school must have teachers who are able to relate to the child as a whole and encourage reflection and conversation, which isn't directive but elicits responses and draws out questions from the children. The absence of psychological authority in a K school creates an environment where the child may think freely without the inner compulsion to be obedient. Because the teacher has come off the pedestal and considers the questions of life also as his own questions, the student may imbibe a natural attitude to such questions. In an atmosphere of affection and mutual respect, the child is not afraid to ask questions about his own experience, his relationships, or about the school. Naturally, there is a place for school rules and expectations of appropriate conduct, but the primary factor remains the direct and human relationship between the student and the teacher. The openness of the mind in a non-authoritarian environment then becomes the soil in which the inquiry into oneself may happen. In K schools, there are several forums in which this interest in questions of life and relationship are nurtured. Some of these are culture classes, open houses, and house contacts. I thought I'll just mention a few of these forums for your knowledge. In these forums, the attitude of the educator and the quality of affection he may have towards the student is of great significance. If the student feels that he can explore questions freely, that he will not be judged for his words or his behavior, and that the educator is friendly and supportive of his growth and learning in an unsentimental way, then there is the possibility of genuine inquiry. This implies that the student has the freedom to ask his original questions, born out of his own perceptions, not out of imitation with others, nor out of dependence on the educator. Suppose, to take an example, a student finds himself in a spot of trouble or is going through some difficult experience. In a non-authoritarian and non-directive environment, his thinking may be something like this. This is just an imaginary story of what a student in such a school might think. I quote, "There is this problem that I have, but I can talk about it in school. Because in this climate, there doesn't seem to be an anxiety in the adults about what it is that I'm experiencing, or an attempt by them to persuade me to change my behavior. They seem more interested in just listening to what I'm saying. Then through the conversation, a question may arise naturally from looking at the whole context of the problem. Perhaps you may get a flavor of this approach if if I can take an example from my experience as a house parent of senior boys between the ages of 15 and 17. With these senior boys, I sometimes take up questions about boy-girl relationships and about sexuality. After some time into the conversation, when it is clear to students that this is an adult who won't quickly judge them or become critical, then there is a natural human response in them to their own experience, born out of a natural inquisitiveness and a desire to understand things as they truly are. This response can gradually develop into a sensitive inquiry, a process of careful reflection. I think this is of value, not just in a school, but in a family as well. The students may not have a profound question initially, some deep or fundamental question, but it will come presently if we let them come to it. So for example, let us say a student comes to talk with me about his intimate feelings for a classmate of his. I'm taking an example from life and relationship, not from the academic context, intentionally. I listen to him without condemnation about his feelings for a girl, for example, in his class. Even though both of us know that romantic relationships are discouraged in school. Since he is experiencing some inner turmoil in his feelings, we may also talk about how, when there is attachment, there is this feeling of jealousy. And with that comes conflict. And presently, the student asks, and I'm talking now about an actual conversation with the student. Presently, the student asks, so what is the meaning of all this? Why do we have to suffer? Can one not love without jealousy? Is that possible at all? I hope to have conveyed what it means for a school to nurture the student's capacity to look at himself. You can only do this if you are not seen by the student as a judge, as a critic. Otherwise, there would be no real relationship and no openness to look delicately and sensitively without any judgment at what is. For the educator, the art of such a conversation with students requires that he grows in his patience and in his resilience to walk along with the student in this ongoing exploration, so that when the time is right, the right question is asked by the student. Let me now take up the second element in the culture of K schools, the value of unoccupied leisure and the quiet mind. In some of the K schools, there is a practice of astachal. At Sahyadri School, during astachal, students and teachers sit quietly on a hilltop for 15 minutes. The purpose of astachal is to create an opportunity for the student to develop a feeling for the quiet mind and its intimations. But for students, young as they are, it can be a mixed experience. Let me share with you some of their questions and responses. Sometimes the children ask why they sit there every evening for 15 minutes in silence. A teacher may respond to the effect that it is some quiet time meant to observe the outer and the inner, the natural environment, and one's thoughts and feelings. A few students feel restless and perhaps find the prospect of remaining still and silent a little worrisome. One student said, Astachal is not that great because we can't keep quiet for a long time. Others, while not so inclined to look inwards, still find something to observe. One of them said, I don't focus on anything during Astachal time. I just sit quietly. I do not find sitting in silence useful. But it is interesting because I like watching people or what they're doing. A few others can be very specific about what they tend to do during Astachal. Perhaps in examining a problem. One girl said, you have some quiet time so that you can think of anything that is stuck in your mind. There are those who find a gentle release from some preoccupation. I sit quietly and try to think about nothing. I try to reduce the tension in my mind. And a few others seem to echo things that they may have heard from their teachers. One student said, throughout the day, thoughts constantly come to our mind and we are engaged in activity. Astachal provides a little space in our day for inner and outer silence, a little time for us to be still and just observe the movement within our minds. Were these students repeating what they had heard from their teachers? Or were they touched by some fleeting intimation, an inward turn through which they could just observe, even if for a moment? It is hard to tell. Krishnamurti's voice appears to reach us as if from a strange wilderness. It seems to ask us to look differently at what exists, both outwardly and inwardly. But this different way of looking, he reminds us, cannot come through control and cultivation. That is why it is so important sometimes to leave oneself fallow, to remain unoccupied. Let me quote from Commentaries on Living. This is from Series 2, Chapter 46. Is silence to be cultivated, carefully nurtured and strengthened? And who is the cultivator? Is he different from the totality of your being? Is there silence, a still mind, when one desire dominates all others? Or when it sets up resistance against them? Is there silence when the mind is disciplined, shaped, controlled? Does not all this imply a censor, a so-called higher self who controls, judges, chooses? And is there such an entity? If there is he not the product of thought? Thought dividing itself as the high and the low, the permanent and the impermanent, is still the outcome of the past, of tradition, of time. In this division lies its own security. Thought or desire now seeks safety in silence, and so it asks for a method or a system which offers what it wants. In place of worldly things, it now craves the pleasure of silence. So it breeds conflict between what is and what should be. There is no silence where there is conflict, repression, resistance. Close quote. During Astachal in Sahyadri, Students and teachers often notice a bird in the sky. I'd like to share this with you. This is the black-shouldered kite. It is a frequent visitor along the slopes of the hill. Often hovering stock still, it remains stationary in the air in spite of a breeze, effortlessly navigating the breeze. How can the bird manage to stay completely still against the unpredictable breeze? Does it somehow know how the breeze is going to flow in the next second? Which must not be possible. Or is it so quick to respond with its natural intelligence that it is one with the breeze, without conflict? The Astachal Hill beckons students and teachers to a quiet place, a way of being with ourselves, from where we may come upon a fullness that is uncultivated. No wonder that some of the alumni, when they visit school, want to sit at Astachal again, in that quiet place. One wonders what they had sensed during their time in school. One wonders what draws them back to Astachal. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Amresh ji. It was really very nice. I don't know, my voice is okay. If anybody has any question, Srinesh has a question. Why don't you speak up?
Sir, voice is echoing. I don't know.
Except for the speaker, if everybody else can mute their audios, it might help. I will also mute mine until you finish.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Sir, you talked about the importance of relationship and self-inquiry towards understanding the nature of one's self. And the nature of self is such that always it tries to say that it is right always. It doesn't accept anything wrong on its side. Even if a person of high caliber or someone points out a mistake. So my question is, if someone, either a relative or friend, someone whom I respect, when he points out a mistake in me, and I don't know whether it is right or wrong, I cannot simply accept or reject it. So how should I take it towards the inquiry in order to find out the truth in that? That is my question. Thank you.
Shall I just respond to?
Yeah, please go ahead. Yes.
Shall I go ahead?
Yeah.
So I think this is a good question. This is a very real question that is, I think it applies to all of us. I did not catch the name of the questioner, but I just have the name so I can address it.
This is Trineshwar.
Trinesh. Can I call you Trinesh?
Yes, thank you.
Yes. So Mr. Trinesh, I think that this is a very relevant question and it applies to all of us, no matter what age we are at. It applies in the school, in the family, sometimes even amongst very close relationships. And I think if I am interested in having the right relationship with the question itself, the issue being discussed, and also with the person or persons involved, then I have to, as you were saying, I have to look at uh, my own identification with something in that matter. If I find that I'm stuck to a certain opinion, then it is important for me to bring that to my awareness. I may not share it with another person, but it is relevant for me to notice that maybe there is a certain vanity in myself. Maybe I am attached to some view of myself. Or maybe there is a self-image that I have that I have not examined yet. And so maybe I'm suggesting that there are two aspects to this. One is the particular thing that is happening. Somebody has given me some advice and I see in myself a resistance to the advice. Because there is a real life situation and some things have to be done in collaboration with the other person, I have to do the best that I can under the circumstances. It's a practical reality, right? But along with that, if one can strive to engage with this other question, to ask myself, what is it that I'm invested in and why? Why is it that I am so vain or so adamant? Why is it that I'm not able to listen simply to what the other person is saying? Am I conditioned to reacting to elders? Is that possible? Similarly, am I conditioned to accepting easily what a person in authority or with some experience is saying? Neither of those two things may be the right approach, because either of those would limit my understanding of things as they are. It would limit my fuller response to the situation as a whole. So even though I have to respond to the particular person, if I'm also holding the general question for myself about the nature of my own motive, and if I'm studying myself in the mirror of that relationship, then I'm likely to keep learning. But I think it may not be, I would only suggest this, I cannot say this for anybody else, but I think both things have to be kept in mind, the specific matter of relating with the other person and the ongoing examination of myself. And in that mirror of relating with the other person, to see my own limitations at work.
Thank you, Amresh. I have three more questions. Savitaji, you want to ask your question or you want me to read it? I think it will be a good idea that you ask yourself. Savitaji, yeah. Please ask, Savitaji. I don't see her.
May I ask,
Sir, I'll come back to you. There are two more questions. Dr. Manjari Shukla, she is from Vasanta College. Manjari, you want to ask your question? Please go ahead. Yeah, please, Manjari, go ahead. Ask your question. I'll read it out. Perhaps Manjari can't read it out. She has a question which says, when awakening starts, it becomes very uncomfortable within, on the one hand, and there is a blissful feeling within for the new perspectives start emerging. On the other hand, there is an anxiety when we are dealing with the worldly relations. How do we cope with this flux within?
That is the real question, isn't it?
Yes.
For all of us. But it is a very valuable question. And it is really the question at the heart of our lives. And it is, I might add that in Krishnamurti's own conversations with teachers and students, he has often brought the question down to the reality of our lives, to the practical, actual reality of our lives. He has not assumed that somehow people all around are experts in this business, that they may ask questions and suddenly transport themselves into some blissful state. Quite the contrary, he has said, you are identified to the others. He may not speak for himself, but to look at you and myself and all of us as people who are living their daily lives along with the limitations that they have, in the sense that I may be identified with something and not yet aware that I'm identified. I may be afraid of asking difficult questions, and I have not yet engaged that fear enough. And so I think that there is a certain, how should you put it, maybe a certain courage. Courage is not a very good word in the Krishnamurti context because he doesn't use it, but we can use it. I think it takes a certain confronting. It takes a certain amount of sense. Sorry,
Mr.
I'm
Dini,
not.
please mute yourself. Mr. Dini, please mute yourself.
So just to finish, I think that the response to your question would probably be found by our own ongoing inquiries. If I find that in the asking of a question there is fear, then to fear I must go. It is the fear that I must then examine, find out what it contains, and stay with that. And ask, how is it that the fear operates in my own psyche? Can I look at this fear without the observer? I don't mean to make it technical and use words that we can quickly borrow from Krishnaji. But can I look at fear and see if I have a response to fear out of an interest in it, rather than becoming so identified with it that I must run. And so there is a certain kind of suffering, which means going through the whole process. There may be fear, there may be the whole body's chemical reaction with it as well. But so long as I'm taking care of the body and I'm striving to live a balanced life in my daily life, and that is something that I must undertake as well. I can't just ask a question about fear, but then not take care of the body and keep it healthy enough. So there is a challenge in the asking of fundamental questions. And I think that your question points to something very fundamental, that there is, as I was saying earlier, a fear in the asking of fundamental questions, because it may upset the things that give me security. But that examination, I think, is of profound significance. And if one has the courage and the clarity, then one would make that journey and make that discovery, and the discovery of the nature of fear, and perhaps find release from that, or an understanding about it at some more fundamental level.
Thank you, Amresh ji. There is a question from Mr. Rama Rao from Hyderabad. He says, can you throw some light on, within inverted commas, look differently? What you want to convey with these words? He wants to know what does it mean to be look differently.
Yeah. So I think this is again one of those questions that lie at the heart of Krishnaji's explorations with everybody that he spoke with. I think if I can put it in my own terms, in terms of whatever my understanding is, I think that the conditioning that we have to conflict, to suffering, to inner turmoil is to run away. You see, it is a very deep response. It seems unnatural, almost life denying, to say that when there is suffering, you please stay with it. It is almost a ridiculous thing to say. What do you mean stay with it? Stay with it and do what? But I think that is where the whole question lies. What is my relationship with suffering? Is really the question that Krishnaji is posing to us as a challenge. If I suffer, and there is even for a fraction of a second a question, why is there suffering? But before I ask the question and let the question grow in myself, I may run away because it is too unbearable. I switch on the television or go after one or the other escape. But to stay on the ground of suffering, you take whatever it is. It could be fear, it could be jealousy, it could be envy, even pride, hurt. Any one of those can be the subject matter of this inquiry, which is raised by a question, what it means to look differently. To look differently, I must first understand how it is that I'm looking usually, right? And in the interesting paradox, if you like, in Krishnaji's work, is that when you look at what you are actually doing, if you are able to stay with that with an interest, with the interest to inquire into it, that is the way forward to looking differently. It is not that you have to go somewhere else. In fact, what we are tending to do is to go somewhere else. Now, my response is bound to be limited because we don't have the time to explore this. But this question is worth exploring for a considerable amount of time to carefully go into what is involved in, as I put it in my talk, the observer interfering in the act of observation. To observe things as they are is this different way of looking. But we are not able to normally, usually, we are not able to observe things as they are. We change it. We don't change it by decision. We change it in these automatic ways that I was describing as unconscious biases. Very quickly, the mind attaches itself to some image, some future time when I will not suffer. I'm suffering now, and there's the distress of it. And I imagine a future day, a future time, and that gives me some relief from the experience of suffering. But in that act of identification, when the observer is operating, there is no inquiry. When the observer comes into being, you're no longer looking, you're no longer observing the fear as it is. So it is a difficult proposition that Krishnaji is inviting us to. He's saying, look at the suffering and find out if you can come to it with interest. What is the nature of suffering? And you can't find out the nature of suffering unless you look at it. You have to look at the real thing. So you have to undergo suffering. That is not very well put. I don't mean that you have to undergo suffering, but you must meet it. And for that, I have to journey into myself and ask myself, what is taking place within myself? What are the ways in which I tend to respond to distress or suffering? And notice the ways in which I escape. Then I might come upon a genuine interest in fear or jealousy or pride. And then something very different can happen. But I have to stay there. if I move away quickly, if I'm habituated, as I was saying, to some form of recognizable escape, respectable escape, and society is constantly giving sanction to that. My own mind has given sanction to it. Then I have to first negate all those different ways in which I run away. I escape from what is. And as I learn about it, I slowly am more capable of looking at the thing as it is, and then I would come upon what it means to look differently.
Thank you, Amresh. There is a question from Dr. Rachna Pandey. Rachna, why don't you speak up yourself? Rachna Pandey.
Yes, sir.
Yeah,
Thank you so
please go
much,
ahead.
sir. Sir, my question to you is, so how can we observe something from multiple perspective, different point of views, something in totality without getting influenced by cultural baggages and biases and the conditioning that we carry, and we are conditioned to do certain thing in certain ways. So because they limit knowledge that comes through observation time and again. And related to this, another query that I'm having is, what should one call the entity which is not self, unassuming self, and other than the observer, thinker self? Since the moment one calls other the other, separation comes and identification becomes very difficult. If I'm able to articulate my queries, sir. Over to you.
As I've understood you, you seem to have asked two questions. The first is how to have multiple perspectives on a particular problem.
Yes, sir.
And second one is about what does one call this other kind of observation which does not involve an observer. What perhaps what is it that we should call it, or what is its nature? That seems to be your second question. Would I be right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So I think that multiple perspectives are a part of education. It's quite important, I think. It happens in the academic setting, in the school setting. It happens quite a lot more in the humanities, if you like, where students are often encouraged to look at complex human and social phenomena from different points of view, and that is encouraged. It is also there in the sciences and mathematics, but because the systems are more ordered, it may not be very apparent. But let us not go too much into that question in the context of academic work. I think that in the context which we are talking about, the mirror of relationship itself, the different perspectives may well be available to us. They are indeed the perspectives that our conditioned responses create. We may, for example, you can consider this problem of hurt again. Somebody says something to me and I'm hurt. And when I'm hurt and I'm strongly identified with hurt, experiencing the frustration of it, the conflict of it, the pain of it, it may not be a simple, straightforward matter for me to think about the situation from a different point of view, particularly the person who seems to have caused me the hurt, right? That is not available often, but it does mean that if I stay with the hurt and ask myself, if I'm capable of asking myself in all humility, maybe I am wrong in thinking that that person did something to me intentionally to cause the hurt that I have experienced. Maybe it was not their intention. Maybe I was hurt, but it was not their intention to hurt me. So it does not make sense for me to blame them. That is a different perspective. And it is born out of only if there is a certain amount of openness, or you might call it a certain humility or a vulnerability, where one is willing to give up the notion that he is my enemy because he has hurt me. Now, when I do that, I come upon a different perspective, which is to see things from the other person's point of view. As I was saying, it can only happen if I'm not strongly identified with my perspective, from the perspective of myself, the one who was hurt. So I think the question of multiple perspectives, perhaps in the way you were talking about it, is related very deeply to whether I'm able to let go of a particular perspective that I'm holding on to out of self-interest. And that is it's a real question in life. The question of being hurt and then exploring the possibility of not harboring animosity, enmity towards the one who has caused me hurt. And if you think about it, this is the fundamental human problem, isn't it? I mean, if you look at what is happening in the Middle East, centuries of conflict between people at large. I mean, when we look at it in terms of political problems and global problems, it looks like it's a remote problem, but it is really the question that you are raising. It is the problem of hurt. He has taken my land, she has said something insulting to me. And if I can let go of my identification with that hurt, with the memory of hurt, if I can let go of my identification with the fear of being hurt again, then I am in relationship with that whole process of being affected by what somebody else has done to me, but with an interest to find out if I can relate with the other person, not being bound to one single perspective that I am hurt and I must now react. So I think your question of multiple perspectives, if taken far enough, would lead oneself to examine whether or not I am attached to my own hurt, my own particular experience. And letting go of that attachment may allow me to explore multiple perspectives. Now, to your second question, I don't know whether it is so important to call it by a particular name. I think that if one is able to come to a point, even in a brief engagement with my own hurt, if I'm able to let go of my hurt, then that is a tremendous thing. What difference does it make what I call it? I could call it freedom from hurt. You can call it, I was momentarily enlightened. Call it anything. You had a glimpse of wisdom. You had an insight. The actual fact of letting go of hurt is a very real thing. And it will change your relationship with the other person. You will be able to smile at somebody with whom you actually harbored, against whom you actually harbored some animosity 5 minutes ago. And you are able to let go and actually relate differently with that person. And if that is possible, then the changed relationship, the reality of it is what matters. You can call it whatever name. You can call it humility, you can call it peacefulness, you can call it affection. But what matters is the fact that that relationship is changed, and it is a step beyond conflict, beyond hatred, beyond harboring enmity against somebody. And that is a very real thing, I think. And often I think Krishnaji points in this direction. He says, look at your actual relationship. And if you cannot change that, then what is the point of, what is the point of religion, spirituality. Let me stop here.
Thank you, Amresh. Mr. Dini, you had a question. Please go ahead and ask.
Ah,
Yeah, please go ahead. Yeah.
Amreshji, two questions are bothering me. Are you able to listen? Hello?
Yes, I can make out your voice, but the words are not very clear. Please go ahead.
The two questions are bothering me. One is whether K schools teach sharing with the children and this not belong to rotten society and not get influenced by it. One thing. Second, they have to maintain this flame of discontent not only as per K, they had failed to the fire. This should be maintained throughout their life. Unless these are maintained, they cannot sustain inquiry. Do the schools teach these two fundamental questions to the students? Otherwise, they can't sustain inquiry.
Yes, I think that that is a big question for Krishnamurti schools, and indeed any serious educator, any educator who has a deep feeling for young people, who has a deep feeling for the journey of life, or who has a deep feeling for nurturing the minds and the hearts of young people so that they may flourish in their lives and come upon a certain, just a harmonious life. But not just in this nice and sentimental portrait that my words are creating probably, also to be able to meet challenges. And as you say, if they don't have their anchor in fundamental questions and in the experience of asking fundamental questions enough, then they will not have the resilience. Then when they are faced with a crisis, there will be an escape into alcohol and drugs and sex, all of that. And the world is just waiting. The world of today is waiting to trap young people in some kind of escape. And young children are more and more, getting influenced by those things. In a recent culture class, one young student who's just 13 years of age asked, what is wrong if you are bored? What is wrong with taking drugs? I am not judging her, and in fact, I didn't judge her. I said, let us take up this question. I think it's a very important question. I don't want to get scared just because a girl is talking about drugs. I want to talk about boredom with them. And I want to be able to ask them. I'm still responding to Mr. Dini's question. Please bear with me. I want to be able to ask the child or the class a question about what is it that you do when you experience boredom? What happens to you? And you see, there is no pill I can give the children. I can't say, okay, here is a fundamental question. Please write it down in your notebook and memorize it. It's of no value at all. So I have to ask a question, not just ask a question to her, but participate in asking that question along with those students. So we may look at the phenomenon of boredom and really ask ourselves, what is our connection to that experience? What is it that you students, and what is it that I, as an older person, think about drugs? What does it do to human life? And you see, any quick response to tell them or show them that this is not right, this is wrong, this is terrible what you are asking about drugs. How dare you ask this question in the class, right? Is of very little value because there is no exploration, no genuine question has been raised. So I want to be able to come work with the students so that they themselves and we together arrive at a question about what does it mean to live in a way that is striving to understand what life is. And what does it mean to quickly take something that is available around myself? There is the smartphone, there are drugs. I have to stay with the questions with the students enough so that somewhere along the way, they may have a connection between their own deeper urges as a human being who's looking for order, who's looking for a deeper understanding of boredom, who's looking for a deeper connection with the nature of things. That part of them has to be awakened. Then that is what they have found. It is not about drugs. I can very easily talk about drugs. In fact, I told them, I said, well, the drugs, the problem is they will probably destroy your brain cells. Alcohol does it too. Tobacco will probably ruin your lungs. There are drugs that are known to destroy brain cells. And a very quick solution can be given. I can tell myself, I have told them that these are the dangers about drugs. But that does not mean that the child has got a deeper insight, so she will never touch drugs again. I have to ask questions of a kind and stay in that investigation with students so that they may come to an understanding from which they will say, I don't want to hurt another person. I don't want to run away from fear. If I'm not able to undertake that journey, then as you say, I may not have done enough work as an educator to sow the seeds of fundamental questions in the soil of their minds so that that becomes the anchor in their lives. And this is a big challenge in the Krishnamurti schools. There are challenges at every corner, in every direction, even as we strive to plant the seeds of these questions in the soil of the students' minds. But it is, I would say, great work. It is not about doing that work and patting yourself on the back and saying you are successful. In fact, most of the time, there is no question of success or failure. The only thing that is relevant is the connection you feel with students as you strive to ask fundamental questions. And this is the work of patience. It is the work of affection. It is not the work of saying, well, I have asked you this question, now tomorrow are you going to behave properly? Right? It is ongoing work.
Thank you, Amresh. I think, Sushilji, we can take one more question, last question. From Dr. Atul.
Last one.
Yeah, Dr. Atul Bhatnagar.
Last question.
Okay. Dr. Atul Bhatnagar, the last question.
Thank you.
Then I have to request one request to sir. So please allow me after this.
Okay.
Thank you.
Dr. Atul Bhatnagar, please.
Yes. My question is a takeoff from a previous question on multiple perspectives, exposing children to multiple perspectives. So what is your feeling or take on exposing children to the needs of differently abled or children with special needs? And another question that is related to this is that can our children be exposed with non-verbal language like Braille and sign language?
In our school, we don't have differently abled children. And there has been a debate sometimes in the Krishnamurti schools, not perhaps very recently, but in the earlier years, about the value of inclusive education. At one point, in fact, we had even considered whether it would be possible for us to have differently abled children in our own school. There was a case of a student who had polio and they had applied to our school. And we had to turn it down because the terrain of our school is extremely variable, there's an undulating landscape. So we had to turn it down. But I think that what you're saying raises questions at more than one level. One is to be resolved. One level is to be addressed at the is one level at which it can be addressed is at the psychological level. How do students respond to those other children who are differently abled? Are they accepting of them, or do they reject them, look down upon them, say hurtful things? And the other is the school's capacity to actually, the teachers need to be skilled to support those children. And that is a challenge. It is not a simple matter. We do have children who are not differently abled at the physical level, but there are children who have what you might call learning difficulties. Some of you may be familiar with some of these terms, dyslexia and attention deficit disorder and ADHD and things of that nature. We don't close the doors of the school to children who have some of these learning difficulties, as they are called. But it does mean that we need to take responsibility for those children. They may need to learn at a different pace. They may need to spend more time perhaps with a special educator who can address their needs. We also have workshops with our own teachers, educating them about these learning difficulties, the so-called learning difficulties. So I think we are open to all of this, but the challenge at the psychological level is a real challenge. And I think students who are not coping very well in the academic environment invariably may feel that they are not good enough. Nobody may say that to them in the school. Teachers may not say that, definitely. And the students also wouldn't say things like that. And yet the environment is such that this child may receive the impression that they have to perhaps strive better, because after all, by the time the students come to class 9, they are preparing for the ICSE exams. We are not free from affiliation with an examination board. And that is one of the serious questions in the Krishnamurti school. The affiliation with an examination board changes a little bit the direction of our the aspect of culture in the senior students. Invariably, they become more oriented to performance, to getting marks in exams. It is only a little bit. It is not something that the teachers emphasize very overtly, but it is a factor. And so when we're looking at differently abled children, they may begin to feel when they are in the senior school that they are not doing as well as others. That is a challenge. We do have mentors in the senior school, teachers who meet students individually and talk to them, help them work at their study skills. They talk to them about managing their time. They talk to them about how they are feeling in school, what the future holds for them. Engage them in conversation so that the students are able to formulate their own questions for themselves and begin to work at them, right? To prepare for college after high school is over. And in that, there is no distinction in the school between one kind of child and another kind of child. What you're saying is a challenge nevertheless. I don't think we have taken the step of learning Braille or learning sign language. There has been some interest in that. Recently, a student gave an assembly talk on sign language. There is a teacher in the school right now who's interested in teaching Braille to students. But it is not that it is part of somehow the environment of the school, and we have students who are differently able across the spectrum of learning challenges and learning styles.
Thank you, Amresh ji. Thanks a lot. Sushil ji, you want to
Yeah,
come in?
yeah. One request, one question to Atul. He has not yet decided the subject of dialogue with Chaitanya and Sarma ji. So this question is with Atul Bhatnagar and challenge with Sir
Ji.
Amresh sir to convey Madam for dialogue. Dialogue or speech whatsoever she wanted to give, and we have enough time. In November she can come. She can come with sir, or she can have dialogue with anybody she likes. So that is the challenge. With this challenge, I leave Amresh sir.
So you will have to communicate with her, Sushil ji. You will have to.
Yeah. Thank you very much. And I
Thank you,
am very,
Amresh ji.
very
Thank you
grateful
once
to you
again.
to accepting this and doing all this great job here. Dubey sir, you will be not there next week.
Yeah, I think 20th we have a meeting of the education committee.
Yeah. If meeting is not, please come. Yeah. Because we have to manage it. The dialogue between Chaitanya Bhatnagar, Chaitanya Nagar, Atul Bhatnagar and Mr. Sharma. Subject they have not yet given.
Okay. So we'll see you on 27th. Yeah.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
please convey thanks from my end and your end to everybody. And my thanks
Thank
to
you.
you first.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Amresh ji. Thanks a lot for talking to us. Yeah. Thanks a lot. Thank you. Bye-bye.